This episode was recorded during the virtual session, Parliamentary Action for Disaster Risk Reduction and Preparedness in the Caribbean, organized by ParlAmericas, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, and the UN World Food Programme in September 2024. In a session moderated by the Honourable Dr. Erecia Hepburn-Forbes, Senator of the Bahamas, Tonni Brodber, representative of the UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, discusses the critical role of parliamentarians in ensuring that disaster risk reduction systems are inclusive and gender responsive, recognizing that factors such as gender, age, ethnicity, and other social dynamics shape people's ability to respond to hazards. Listen to Ms. Brodber as she explores the importance of data-driven approaches in disaster preparedness, calling for legislation, parliamentary oversight, and budget allocation that address the specific needs of marginalized populations in the Caribbean.
Always a pleasure to be in these kinds of sessions. So I'll be picking up exactly where Jair dropped off in terms of the importance of one, ensuring, and it was something that was repeated by Senator Hepburn-Forbes, is the notion that we don't have to have disasters. We are in a hurricane zone. So the fact that we actually have hurricanes or flooding or things like that, that's natural, but that's a hazard. What makes it a disaster is whether we have put things in place effectively or not. And so I'm going to be talking about better practices and lessons learned in inclusive disaster risk management. So the level of risk and whether a hazard becomes a disaster or not depends on many things. So we're looking at geographical location, livelihood reliance on the environment, the exposure to the consequences of climate change, vulnerabilities, which we'll get into more, the type of hazard that we experience, as well as sex, gender, age, disability, ethnicity, and sexuality. We had a conversation previously with judicial officers discussing the difference between risk and vulnerability. In our region, there's always a pushback. Why are we speaking about gender? Often because persons think gender equates women. We have a lot to unpack there, but we won't do that right now. When we speak about risk and vulnerability, and that vulnerability that we speak to in terms of whether a hazard really is going to manifest itself in the form of disaster for certain people, is because of an understanding of what makes people vulnerable and who is most marginalized. And generally, if we look at the definitions of vulnerability and marginalization, there's certain groups that experience more marginalization and vulnerability because of their ability to adapt, cope, or deal with the impacts of external shocks. Also, their ability to access what their community, their national framework has in terms of assets or systems and services. So to be clear, when we're speaking about sex, we're speaking about a person's biological and physical characteristics that are inherited or determined at birth. In the world, although there are two sexes identified on this particular slide, because these are the two sexes we know most, female and male, there are persons who are intersex, and it is biological. And every time there's an Olympics, we hear more and more about this because many people don't know that they're intersex, but it is a reality. Gender, though, is referring to the social, cultural, power dynamics and emotional and behavioral differences between those who we consider to be men and women, generally because of sex, male and female. Gender identity and sexual orientation are connected, but they are not only relevant to issues of gender equality and gender equity. When we're talking about vulnerability and risk, though, we need to understand how does sex, how does class, ethnicity, age, race, ability, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity affect a human being's ability to manage a natural hazard. We speak often about resilience. The things that make people resilient are the opportunities to be able to escape vulnerability and be less marginalized. So what is it that parliamentarians do, and how do we see parliamentarians really playing a key role in developing a framework at the national level that moves beyond an understanding of everybody should get the same thing, regardless of how they're moving through this world based on their sex, their class, their age, their ability or disability, or their race, towards not only equity, but looking at moving towards a systemic transformational change. So in this case, we had CPL happening recently in the Caribbean. We're moving from a fence to a chain link fence, a wooden fence to a chain link fence, because the issue is not the person's capacities. It's actually what is preventing them from having access to whatever the services are that they need. We also see parliamentarians in their roles as oversight, budgetary oversight, accountability, and legislation or decision making. We look at them as being able to ensure that persons are empowered, understanding where the barriers have been so that what is making persons more vulnerable, what is making persons more marginalized, and creating opportunities towards what is defined as empowerment. And that may mean different things for different people. These are the components of what many people feel to be empowerment. And this has been pulled together by various UN agencies and other organizations. The ability to have access to resources, dignity, social protections, access to justice, a skill set that is valued, agency, and the ability to make decisions. When we have natural hazards, what generally happens immediately is that the things that define our humanity are often gone. Our homes, our devices, in terms of, I remember one parliamentarian, actually, I believe she recently passed, a former Speaker of the House in Dominica, was speaking about in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, the fact that everyone was asking her to be resilient, but there was a lot of dignity in her clothes and in her shoes, and that had washed away. So understanding that these are parts of the elements of what make human beings feel the most human. And these are often the most at risk during a natural hazard. Your access to social protection, your access to justice, resources, your ability to make decisions, and how you can best apply your skill set. So we know, and I think Jair did an excellent job of speaking about the way in which we need to ensure parliamentarians advocate. We need to look at legislation, ensuring that pre-disaster and planning, there's legislation and laws that do the best possible to mitigate against the worst outcomes of a potential hazard. And we'll get into some detail about what that could be. And Jair has also given an example of the early warning systems. Preparedness, advocating for and supporting the budget use for relief efforts, and not just after, but we know hurricanes come every year. We know flooding happens every year. How can the budget be in place for gender responsive relief efforts as well? Understanding how people, again, are navigating their communities in the world. The debating. What are the important issues of the day throughout, especially as it comes to response and relief? What is being prioritized when we look at the ways in which we are using social protection to respond, and what is being prioritized when we're looking at economic empowerment to respond to the aftermath of a natural hazard? Budgeting and taxation, checking and approving not only the government spending, but encouraging private sector partners who may be contributing to the impacts of climate change. And of course, we know our region, at least the Caribbean region, is contributing minusculely to this. But still, if there is anything, making sure that taxation is used as a negative incentive for those who are contributing. Scrutiny, really checking and challenging the work so that we're accountable, not opposing just to oppose, but definitely consistently ensuring that the best impact possible for the population is at the forefront of any kind of scrutiny that is happening. And then finally, in all of this, ensuring that the approval of the assessments and any plans for post-disaster needs are including where people are And I'm saying where people are instead of gender, because sometimes I did the definitions to make sure no one got distracted. But this is about where are our girls, where are our boys, what is happening to women, and what is happening to men. And I'll get into some detail into that. But this is generally just a slide to show you the cycle of disaster management and preparedness, and where we see the role of parliaments in ensuring that at each stage, there is a role and action to mitigate, ensure that there's preparedness, effective response and relief, as well as rehabilitation and reconstruction. I just wanted to go through these very quickly, because if we're going to have evidence-based legislation, evidence-based policy, evidence-based budgeting, we need to know where women and men are in our societies. We know at this stage, especially as it pertains to social protection and what happens before and after a hurricane, those providing the care for the most vulnerable, the elderly and children, are women. With that in mind, and there's other data at the end of my presentation, we know that 46% of women in the Caribbean who have ever been in a relationship have experienced some form of violence in their intimate partnership. We also know that this violence increases when there are external stresses. We know that only 8% of women are entrepreneurs in our region, and of that 8%, only 1% of them actually have employees. I'm giving all of these examples to show when a hazard happens, if a woman is affected and she's a business owner, the likelihood of her having, one, staff is minuscule, two, an opportunity to actually have time to work is minuscule, because she'll be taking care of those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of a natural hazard at the time. So how can we make sure that we're looking at where those women are and where those men are? We have some details again about where men are and how men are affected by hazards. And that is also something that needs to be able to inform the way in which we legislate and support men in the aftermath of a hazard. In the Caribbean region, men are more likely to die in the aftermath of a hazard than anybody else, because they are most likely to take risks to save property and people. So data and analysis is a better practice in the Caribbean for preparedness. Those countries that have completed studies so that they understand what the inequality of climate change and disaster risk in the Suriname, for example, are winning in terms of a better practice, because they at least have the data and some analysis to be able to say what is happening to who, when, and why. Capacity building. Who is supposed to do what when? Now, it was fantastic to hear from Speaker Anisette George about the progress being made in Trinidad and Tobago, especially because there's a specific disaster management agency in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, the role that the Red Cross, a civil society organization that plays a critical role in disaster response plays, is critical, as well as understanding each agency, ministry, and department, better understanding what is our role and how are we best coordinated to be able to effectively and efficiently carry out these roles when we too may have been impacted by the hurricane is critical. So that's why you need the national action plans. Now we're moving to nationally determined contributions. How much do those plans speak to the other policies from every other agency, including the gender policies? Or are they siloed? We have some better practices of coordination in the Caribbean, but we need to make sure that that's something that Parliament, in your scrutiny role, does to make sure that all of the plans are, in fact, disaster resilient. Grenada has an excellent better practice because they have a gender budget, for example. So they know what is going where and tracking to whom it goes to and why. We have done a lot of capacity strengthening trainings across all of those countries that you saw the maps of in the last slide on gender responsive climate budgeting in the Caribbean. But this is critical. And we say gender responsive, it's really just efficient budgeting, understanding why someone is getting funding or not. Some other better practices in the early action stage. Some countries immediately reach out to SEDIMA and the UN for engagement and coordinated engagement. That's fantastic. We've seen other cases where persons are just landing in countries in the aftermath of a disaster and there's no coordination. So that coordinated early action response is critical. But when you include the national gender machinery, for example, in Antigua and Barbuda, as well as in Grenada and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then you're starting to get to some of the most marginalized, because a lot of the people who those organizations work with already have experienced some form of challenge in which they're already engaging with the state. So not only engaging the national gender machineries, but the relevant civil society organizations is a critical role in early action, utilizing local suppliers where possible and regional suppliers where it's not for early response. There are a lot of packs that are being created, dignity kits, hygiene kits. Get the local economy restarted. This is something that happened in Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Grenada. Use the businesses in the country. And that's something that parliamentarians can support through policy guidance. May not necessarily be legislation, it's up to you, but ensuring that you don't just go far for what can be sourced close to the country. Better practices in early action as well. If you've done the pre-work with regards to understanding who benefits from your social protection, then you have a more targeted and effective social protection response. And your population better understands why certain people are getting certain kinds of social protection support and others are not. Gender-aware beneficiary analyses had been completed in St. Lucia, Jamaica, and Grenada, as well as St. Vincent and the Grenadines before Hurricane Beryl hit. These were able to be shared immediately with our colleagues at WFP, who you'll hear from afterwards, and UNICEF, and the government, so they could better see who would need what kind of support. Getting that immediate self-care and psychosocial support responses for adults and children was critical. And an opportunity to activate an emergency response in gender-based violence referral pathways. This happened in Antigua and Barbuda, but you can only do this if you have an effective gender-based violence referral pathway. And there should be every kind of violence referral pathway so that you don't see a halt to access to justice in the aftermath of a natural hazard. In the recovery and response, Trinidad and Tobago has an excellent better practice in that they already have the possibility for digital tracking of protection orders. So we will not find ourselves in a situation like one country did, where someone who had a protection order against them found themselves in the same shelter as the person who had the protection order out against the person. Luckily, that person raised their hand and said, I should not be here, and was able to be moved. But this is in protecting both the person who has the protection order and the person who put out the protection order. The job opportunities, looking at job opportunities beyond just construction to also care. There is an assumption that elderly women and women will just care for the children and the elderly, and there's no compensation. And many people lose their jobs during this time because they're caring for their children because the schools are closed. This is, if you're looking at the cash for work programs for construction, why not also care once you have the right kinds of policies and safeguards in place? Include the national gender machineries and the civil society organizations in the response. And it could also be your community departments or development agencies. When you're building back, don't just build back the same, try to build back equal and better as much as possible. Insist on sex disaggregated data consistently, and consistently highlight the mental health and well-being. We just came from a meeting talking about citizen security and the fact that there's the belief that after a disaster, you see an increase in crime and violence. Yes, but this might all be linked to these issues as well.